Hello everyone and welcome back to PCA's Garage. This is Tech Tactics Live episode 9. Today we've got a full show for you. Although we won't be wrenching on anything, we've got lots of stuff here to talk about. And the subject itself is just, it's going to lead to a lot of discussion. Motor Oil 101 and what you need to know. Here in Maryland, we're still under 50% restriction. So just to explain for those of you that first time here on Tech Tactics Live with us, it's just me in the garage. We have a few cameras set up, static, so not a whole lot going on in terms of camera angles, but I do have some staff that will be monitoring all of the live chats and streams that you can participate in, and so please do that. For those of you that have seen this episodes or seen these episodes before, we do have raffle prizes. So make sure that you put your name and where you're from in the chat section, and then we will pull winners around 8:30. So make sure you do that before 8:30. So speaking of raffle prizes for the show, I want to thank LN Engineering. They are giving to us 3 prizes tonight, 3 prizes. The first prize, a case of DT40 oil, about $140 value. They're also giving us an oil change bundle, which includes a spin-on filter and a magnetic drain plug, about $175 value. And then also a SPEEDiagnostix oil kit, $65 value. So 3 of you will win tonight. Make sure you get your name before in the chat function before 8:30. So we'll jump right into it. We only have about an hour and we've got a lot to cover. If you enjoy this episode, if you've checked out episodes before, I really encourage you to please hit the like button, subscribe to this channel so that you'll see future videos. And also, I've heard it helps our algorithms if you comment in the YouTube comment section too. So if you enjoy it, please help us out there. So without further ado, I would like to introduce to you one of my favorite tribologists. You're going, what's a tribologist? Okay, I have to be truthful. I have to tell you, I only know one tribologist, and he is my favorite. A tribologist is a certified lubrication specialist, but it sounds way fancier when you say tribologist. But as a day job, he's actually the Vice President of Sales and Marketing for Total Seal. And if you've been to PCA events, especially Tech Tactics, if you've been to Parade, he's no stranger. It's Lake Speed Jr. Lake, thank you for joining us.
Hello, Vu. Hello, PCA members. Hope everybody's doing great. And thanks for making this possible so we can get together and talk a little bit about one of my very most favorite subjects, which is tribology. We love talking about motor oil because I love engines, and this is going to be a lot of fun.
And motor oil, man, it's, if you look on forums and you talk about, or you search on motor oil, I mean, everyone has an opinion. So let me just start this whole segment in saying, we're here to talk in generalities. We're to educate. You might have a favorite oil, you might have a favorite process, and that's great, and share with the others. We're not going to say one's better than the other because that's not our function here. We're really just trying to educate you about tribology, okay? So let's start from the very basic, understanding the purpose of motor oil. And Lake, before you dive into it sort of from the tribologist level, I'm just gonna say, I believe motor oil is basically like the lifeblood of your car. And you need to take care of it, and we'll talk all about that. But the purpose of motor oil, take it away.
Oh, you're spot on, Vu. Motor oil is the blood of the engine. If it's the best analogy between our body and an engine is, the pistons are like the lungs, and the camshaft is like the brain, and okay, your motor oil is your blood. And people think about oil and they typically think about, it's a lubricant. It's there to reduce friction and things like that. But really, motor oil has more than one job, especially in a modern engine. So an oil isn't just a lubricant. It's also a coolant. It cleans. Basically, it's taking away the combustion byproduct, any dirt, debris, wear material in the engine and moving it to the oil filter so it can be cleaned and removed from the system. But it also is a medium of hydraulic power, fluid transfer. So you think about variable valve timing engines, cam phasers, and things like that. You're using the oil as a hydraulic fluid, as well as a lubricant, as well as a coolant, as well as a cleaning agent throughout the engine. So it's really important to understand that motor oil is a complex blend of many different chemicals, and it has a very complex job because it's going to be doing things throughout many different jobs throughout an engine, and the engine has a lot of different speeds and loads and temperatures and surface finishes and materials throughout the engine. So complex environment, complex chemistry, pretty complex job. That's why I find it fascinating.
Yeah, and I go back to my early days with cars and simple V8s, V6s, or something like that. Those engines were very simple, more mechanical, not very advanced. But now you talk about today's engines in cars; they're so extremely complicated that I'm guessing the oil plays a much more vital role in keeping everything together.
Well, we were talking about this the other day, that in the old days, there was, mineral-based oils, and there was a pretty narrow set of viscosity options. So the car engineers and the guys who were building the engines, they would design, the clearances, and they would think about the operating environment of the engine, and they would select a motor oil viscosity recommendation based on that. Well, today, the oil chemistry, the viscosity, is an engineered component in the engine. So the surface finishes they're using, the bearing clearances they're using, the materials they use, that's also contemplated or brought into equation with the oil itself, right? How is the oil going to impact that material? Will it cause it to swell? Will it degrade it over time in any way possible? And then if I want to go to a lower viscosity oil for better oil flow, to maintain that oil film between the two parts, that viscosity can be relative to the surface roughness, right? So I've got this handy dandy device back here called a profilometer in this case, all right? This piece can measure the surface roughness in the micron level. So there are parts being made for these engines now that are being engineered with very specific surface finishes that enable the use of the low viscosity oil. So it's very much an engineered process, like we talked about before. And that's what the difference between, what you did years ago and what happens today is the environments are very different. A lot of it because, we have better computer control that can allow things that you didn't have the ability to do before when it was mechanical, just couldn't do it fast enough. And then there are things like emissions and things like that that also play a factor into all of the changes that have happened.
Yeah, so I always put it in terms of the recipe for everything that's going on in the engine is so much more complex now. If you change one single ingredient that's not to the spec of the recipe, the output or the final product changes dramatically, right? So you want to make sure that you're sticking to whatever the recipe originally called for. So let's talk about
recipe is a great analogy. In fact, I've started to butt in just to give you and everybody who's watching a perspective on what order of magnitude change is happening in that recipe. A transmission fluid from 40 years ago would have contained 4 different components. Today, a modern automatic transmission fluid contains up to 27 different components.
Wow.
Yeah.
Wow. Yeah, pretty complicated. So speaking of advancements, if I rewind back to high school days, I think that was kind of around when you started. I'm sure synthetic oils have been around longer, but you really started to hear about synthetic oils in the mainstream in the late 80s, early 90s. So do you mind sharing with our viewers what's the difference between traditional Dino oil versus synthetic?
Okay, so a lot of people, and we have probably done some research, and they may have heard about the different groups, the API classification groups. So there's 5 classification groups. Groups 1, 2, and 3 all begin life as crude oil. So group 1 is what's called a solvent refined base oil. So you're beginning with crude oil, and then you're taking, they call it the cut off the fractioning tower. They're taking that cut of crude oil, then they're solvent refining it to get the bad impurities out. And that is what most engines used for the better part of 100 years. Then in the early 90s, you started having a growth in what was called the group 2, which is that same cut off the fractioning tower, but as opposed to hitting it with solvent, now they call it a hydrocracker. So they're using a hydrogen infusion under high pressure and high temperature to change the molecular structure to try to improve the purity of the oil, if you will. Clean up the bad actors in there, because that's really the goal, is that within crude oil, there are some really, really good molecules. And the idea of refining is to try to get it down to just the molecules you want and get rid of everything else. That's why when you drive by, say, one of the big refineries in like Houston or something like that, that's what that big giant thing is. It's a big giant chemistry set, really. And the goal is to take that crude oil and break it into different components, the components you want, and send the component you want where you want it, so it can be blended together with other additives and things like that to yield the end product that you wish to be able to produce. But that's an imperfect science. By the early 2000s, we came out with what they call Group 3. All right, so we started off with Group 1, solvent refined. Group 2 was the hydrocracked, and then Group 3 was the severely hydrocracked. So take an engine analogy, you go from just a naturally aspirated engine to your turbocharged engine. And so you turned up the boost on it, and that's really what they did with the hydrocracking process to create the Group 3. And so Group 3 is the purest of the mineral-based oils. But 30 years before that, ExxonMobil had pioneered the technology behind what's called polyalpha olefin. So that's PAO, and that's what we call Group 4. So Group 4 is your PAOs, and a lot of people, like the purists, will say, well, that's the only true synthetic. And very famously in 1996, there was a lawsuit between Castrol and Mobile about that, because Mobile was marketing synthetic oil, Mobile 1, that was based on the Group 4 PAO. But Castrol was using Syntec and saying it was synthetic, but they were using the Group 3. And it was a big lawsuit. And in the end, a judge, somebody said that, well, both of them have been manipulated in a process. So while one began as crude, the other one began as gas, and it was a gas to liquids process. The reality is they were both influenced by man. That way, they're not natural products anymore. Therefore, they can both be called synthetic. And that's really what opened the door for the marketing of synthetic products, because before you had ExxonMobil that had basically pioneered the PAO technology. It was very expensive, and everybody else pretty much had to buy from them or one of the other 2 companies in the whole world that actually make it. And that's probably a good point to point that out. even today, there's only 3 companies on the planet that make PAO synthetic base oil. There's many, many others that make group 1, group 2, group 3. So there's a lot more supply of those than there is synthetic. But so when that ruling came out, yeah.
So technically these oils are like genetically modified foods, not, maybe I'm hungry,
Yeah.
That's probably, I'm hungry, I haven't had dinner yet.
They are.
But maybe it's more, like when I think of synthetic, I think of it as like you know, it's a different base, but you know, if you're talking about crude oil and it's been modified, that's why it's synthetic, because it's not naturally occurring, but it's not like it came from a totally different source originally.
No, I mean, most PAOs actually come from refinery gas. So you're taking decene gas off the top of the tower, which you would have burned off. Now you're taking it and you're reconstituting it to build the molecule. In the end, groups 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5, and don't think that 5 is somehow another better than 4 or 3 or 2 or 1 because the number's higher. That's not a purity rating. Group 5 just means it's neither one of the previous 4. So it can be mineral-based oil. It can be vegetable-based oil. It could be a synthetic ester. Or a, my mind is going blank on me right now, sorry. So you have paraffinic oils and you got naphthenic oils. So there's 2 different types of crude. So your naphthenics fall into group 5. So it's still an oil, still a crude oil, but it's not a paraffinic crude, therefore it falls into group 5. So be careful of the trap that the higher number somehow denotes higher quality.
Right.
That's not always the case. It's
well,
always
we've got
different.
Great
that's
attendance
the key thing.
Tonight, and so I wanted to take a question from Yogi Bear.
Sure.
Yogi Bear wants to know the right oil for their 1994 968. I've heard lead or zinc needs to be added. So again, we're not going to be talking about brands per se, but if you can address what Yogi Bear should be looking for in the right oil for their 968, which we actually have the 968 right here.
Awesome. So do not put lead in the oil. Lead is for fuel, not for oil. So let's just get that straight off the bat. Adding zinc is something that people started to do in the mid-2000s when the off-the-shelf motor oils had the ZDP levels reduced for emissions reasons. So because yours is a 94, that engine would have come with an oil that had a higher level of ZDP, probably somewhere in like the 1,200 to 1,400 part per million range. The good thing is there's lots of brands of oil now on the market that already have the correct amount of ZDP already blended into the oil. So I'm not a big fan of playing chemist and buying a zinc additive off the shelf and pouring it in your oil, because I happen to know, because I formulated lots of oils, that the blend order and the blend temperature are important to the outcome, the ultimate outcome and ultimate potential of the oil. So really, for that kind of engine, you're probably looking at either a 1550 or a 2050 engine oil, and you'd want one that has a higher level of zinc in it already. There's lots of options. You know, people that know me already know that I used to work for Driven, and they've got some products that are really good. The Mobile one off the shelf anymore has got the 1550 has a boosted level of ZDP in it again. Valvoline VR1. Those are just 3 I can think of off the top of my head that I know that would be the appropriate viscosity that would also have that higher level of ZDP for Yogi Bear.
Yeah, so the key is if your car required it when it was new and when the car was introduced, you should try to pick a similar oil that has the ZDP levels to maintain it and keep it in your car, as opposed to switching to a different oil that might have a lower level.
Correct. It goes back to, you want to begin choosing an oil not with the oil brand. You want to begin with the specification that the engine manufacturer chose for that engine when they built it. And
All
then
right.
you want to use that spec along with the appropriate viscosity for what you're doing. And then you choose the brand last, essentially saying, I trust this brand to deliver that viscosity with that additive package that meets that spec
Right.
on a consistent basis.
So speaking of viscosity, let's do our first true or false session here. So let me get the first question.
All right.
You ready for this? Everybody, I
ready.
want you to answer on the chat here. A 20W50 means it is 20 when it is cold and a 50 when it is hot. True or false? True or false? I'm going to say false.
False.
False, 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 false. So the next topic is about oil weights and viscosity. So if you could elaborate a little bit on why that's false.
Okay, so I mean, we say it all the time. We talk about oil weights. Technically, there are no weights in motor oil. That W stands for winter. It doesn't stand for weight. So the common thinking is, well, it's a 20 when it's cold and a 50 when it's hot. If you follow that logic, that meant the oil got thicker as it got hotter. That never happens.
That never happens.
All oils, I mean, your pancake syrup gets thinner as it gets hotter. So that W stands for winter. And what they do is they take the oil, they put it in like a beaker, and they put a rod inside of it. And they chill the beaker and the oil down to a specified temperature. Typically, they begin at like 0 degrees Celsius. And then they start moving down 10 degrees at a time. And they measure the torque it takes to turn that rod in the oil. What essentially they're trying to do is they're measuring what's called the cold cranking resistance. Think about it. If it's 0 degrees outside, what does that crankshaft have to do? It's got to turn in the oil. The key is, will the oil allow it to turn over at that temperature? The easier it turns when it's cold, the lower the number before the W.
Gotcha. So we talked a little bit about, we talked quite a bit about the importance of viscosity, as part of the recipe for the engine. A question or a number of questions online here ask about change intervals. Growing up, my dad was always saying 3,000 miles, 3,500 miles on our car, change the oil. And now with, more the modern cars, you're seeing recommended changes of like 10,000 miles, 15,000 miles. So my question to you is that because everything has advanced that these oils can last that long? Or is it simply a financial thing where manufacturers are like saying, well, if we're going to offer motor oil as part of selling the car or the motor oil change, let's change it, at 10,000 miles as opposed to 3,000. So what's your take on that?
Well, it's a multiple kind of mixture answer. There's not one thing only that has dictated the longer drain intervals. Now, one thing is that improvement from your group 1 to the group 2 to the group 3, that hydro cracking process, removing the impurities, is taking out the chemical weak links. Because from the oil marketer's perspective, when they say oil life, they mean the useful life of the oil chemically. As long as that oil is still within a certain, design parameter, specification to what it was new, then it's still considered good. So with the oil being pure, more clean, less weak links, it can go longer before it chemically degrades to the point that it falls outside of that specification range of being an acceptable motor oil. So that's one reason why. The other thing is fuels have changed a lot over time. You know, back in the old days, we had higher sulfur fuels. And one thing that exists in all of these engines are piston rings. I want to get it here, hold it up. There it is. And that end gap on that piston ring, as you can see right there, is a way that blow-by happens. So you get fuel going into the engine. Unfortunately, not every drop of fuel gets atomized and burned in every combustion cycle. So inevitably, there's going to be blow-by, and there's going to be debris, fuel, blow-by contamination getting into the crankcase. Well, that sulfur in the fuel gets into the crankcase. Well, water is also created during each combustion event. Also gets by those piston rings. That water and that sulfur mixed together, they create sulfuric acid. That's the reason why a lot of old engines, they didn't wear out because the metallurgy was bad and they were poorly designed. No. They corroded out.
So
because
they corroded
of the high
internally.
level. Yes.
Wow.
That you had those weak acids attacking the metal, softening the metal, which meant it wore faster. Yeah. That's exactly what happened. So people that have done oil analysis and are probably familiar, if they've used some of the labs that have been around for a while, of what's called TBN, total base number. So that's a test that was developed decades and decades ago when we had those higher sulfur fuels, because that's how you knew when to change your oil, was when the acid level got too high. So base number, just like anybody that has a pool, they know about pH, right? So your acid's down here, your base is up here in terms of pH. And as those two come together, if they hit that meeting point, that's when you change the oil. Yeah. So that was that TBN test. Well, let me
interrupt you real quick because we're about 2 minutes from 8:30. So for all of you that want to be in the raffle, make sure you put in your name and where you're from in the chat area. So I just want to make sure, and then we'll pull the names and we will announce the winner of the case of DT40, the bundle, spin-on filter, oil change bundle, and as well as the oil diagnostics kit. And again, thank you to LN Engineering for providing those raffle prizes. So back to you, Lake. Sorry, I didn't mean to cut you off. I just want people to make sure they get a chance to win those awesome prizes.
Oh, heck yeah, I got to do that part. That's the best part of watching this whole thing, is getting the free stuff. So what we're with the whole idea with the TBN and why it's not really a relevant test anymore in terms of determining your oil life is because we don't have high sulfur fuels anymore. Anybody that owns a diesel car or truck already knows that you've gone from high sulfur fuels to low sulfur fuels. So, and the more they put ethanol in the fuel, guess what ethanol doesn't have? Sulfur. So today's modern fuels are very low sulfur. So that's another thing that's enabled that longer drain interval, is because you don't have that same level of acid buildup occurring. I say it can't happen, but it's not as prevalent as it used to be. The base oil is better. And then, the third thing that you mentioned is, most new cars, there is a Consumer Reports or, JD Power and all that, and they look at the cost of ownership. That's factored into how cars are rated. So yeah, if the manufacturer can stretch that oil change interval with the low sulfur fuel and the better quality oil that would have given them, say, 7,500 miles, if they can push that to 10,000 miles, that helps out in their metrics. And I mean, the environmental people give them, EPA, they give car makers credit for that. Like if you extend drain intervals, then you get an attaboy. We help you out on that because that's less waste oil going back into the environment. So there's several different factors going on in that. Before I forget,
let me ask you another interval question, because I think a lot of PCA members, Porsche owners, find themselves in this situation, and I hang out with you enough to know that, you know, so my car typically doesn't, you know, hit 10,000 miles a year, my Porsche, and yet, you know, come fall or October, November time, I always change the oil before I put it away. And it sounds like it's pretty extravagant to do, so to speak, is to change, you know, let's say I've changed it last fall, you know, in January, February, you know, I start driving it and I drive it for a couple of months, and again, I get to fall again, then I'm changing the oil. And it's less than a year, but definitely less mileage than a normal change interval, but I still do it because you've drilled into me, Vu, before you put it away in the winter, no matter if you drove it 100 miles or if you drove it, you know, 5,000 miles, change that oil before you put it away. So share with our viewers about that particular interval being at least once a year.
Well, that is the other key part. You know, obviously we were talking about the drain intervals getting longer on the OEM levels and things like that, but that yearly oil change for a low mileage vehicle is really important. And let me give you a story as to why. There was a lady named Shirley Schwartz who worked for General Motors R&D. And she was a pioneer in the field of tribology. Her nickname was Sister Sludge. And within the tribology community, she was famous for saying she could destroy anyone's motor oil in less than 3,000 miles.
Whoa.
All she had to do was give it to her grandmother, who lived in Wisconsin, that lived 1 block from the church and 1 block from the market. So she would get up and go to mass every day, drive her car down there, and then maybe in the afternoon she might drive the car the other direction a block to the market. And so she was always doing short trip driving. Remember we said a minute ago.
The worst you can do to an engine.
Oh, it's the worst thing you can do, because 2 things happen during short trip driving. One, the fuel enrichment is higher. So you're putting more fuel in the engine in order to, one, make sure that there's enough fuel for it to burn properly, but you're also heating up the catalytic converter for emissions reasons. So when you're putting more fuel in the engine and you're not burning it all, that means more fuel dilution in the oil, right? And that's never a good thing, because your lubricant should be your lubricant and your fuel should be the fuel, and it's not Reese's peanut butter. It doesn't work better together. Other thing is the engine is making moisture with every combustion cycle. And when the engine temperature is low, now I'm putting
moisture.
No, you're not burning off the fuel. You're not burning off the moisture. And that cocktail will destroy the oil.
Yeah.
And that's what she was going after. So what happens a lot of times is, you know, PCA members, yeah, I'm one, so, you know, not preaching, I'm preaching to the choir, right? One of me, is that we take care of our cars. We love our cars. And if that paint job is perfect and you've got that 718 GTS, it's awesome. So sometimes you want to go drive it, but you don't want to drive it too much. So what happens is you do a lot of short trip driving, and it never gets a chance to really get up to temperature. So the mileage may be short, but the oil's in bad shape. You know, idling an engine is really bad on an engine. It's just not a good thing for it to idle it. I mean, some guys I know in the wintertime, because they're worried about the engine, they'll go out there and crank it up every week and let it run for a minute or two.
Yeah, I've heard that, yeah. That's like the worst thing you can do.
Oh, yeah, it's terrible. So that's what we're saying, is that once a year oil change, even if you only have, 500, 1,000 miles on the engine.
And the way I look at it is, it might sound extravagant that you're putting, let's say, 9 quarts, 10 quarts in your car, doing the oil change once a year. But to me, I think in the long run, the health of your engine is going to be much better for it by doing it. Because if you end up ruining the engine, as that lady did, replacing an engine is going to be much more expensive. I just wanted to say real quickly.
Engines are expensive, oil is cheap. There's no doubt about it.
So I'll first say to Lance Johnson, yes, you are right. I do need to get out and drive my car more, so I will do that. So Hector had a question here about, I mentioned, we'll get to the question on the screen here just in a second, but Hector mentioned, I mentioned doing my annual oil change in the fall, and Hector is asking, is it quote unquote wrong to change the oil in the spring?
Well, it's not ideal, because when you're putting the car away for the winter and you already have acids and moisture and contamination in the engine, you're just letting it sit there and attack the seals and the bearings and everything else in the engine. So it's way better to put the car away in storage on clean, fresh oil, not dirty, used oil.
So it's not the time of the season. It's really changing that oil before you put it away for an extended period of time, whenever that happens to be, right?
Whenever that happens to be.
All right, we're going to let me announce the winners, if you don't mind, Lake, and then we'll get back to it.
Sure.
Again, hopefully everyone's enjoying this discussion. This is what we do at Tech Tactics normally, and if this is the stuff you like, please hit the like button, subscribe, put comments, and hopefully you like the technical side. This is much more technical than we've done in the past couple of episodes. So if you like it, let me know if you want me to reel it back. But when I talk to Lake, it's amazing to me that when he goes into full Tribologist mode. But let me announce the winners. So for the case of oil, congratulations to Alan Novak. For the oil change bundle, congratulations to Christopher McAuliffe. And for the oil testing kit, congratulations to Andrew Tate. So the three folks there, make sure you send a note to Damon, and we'll get your address and we'll get you all squared away with the raffles. Let's go to a couple true and false questions. So let's go true and false number 2. Synthetic oil is so slippery that it causes roll bearings to slide instead of roll. That sounds weird to me, so I'm just going to say false.
You're spot on, Boo. You got it.
Yes.
That is definitely a one of those wives' tales that has kind of come up. And, I really never heard that much in the Porsche community, but you do hear it from time to time in other areas, that the idea that synthetic oil is so slippery that the needle bearings no longer have enough traction and they just begin to slide, and then that causes the engine to fail and to wear out. And that's actually not the case at all. What happens a lot of times when this is taken, what has actually happened is, one, it could be that, say, a dirty old engine, you put synthetic in it, and synthetics typically are premium oils, kind of like premium fuel has more detergents in it than standard fuel. Not just higher octane, but like the top tier fuel has more detergent in it. Well, most synthetic oils typically have a more robust additive package. And if it cleans the engine up, then you can get debris in there, and that debris can actually get in there and cause the needle bearings to stick and not do that. And the other thing that can happen too is if you get really, really crazy in terms of like your camshaft and valve springs, you can get those parts out of control, and they can beat each other. And a full synthetic oil, especially if it's a lower viscosity synthetic oil, doesn't actually have the high pressure film thickness. Because the synthetic oils molecules are uniform, what can happen is under that high pressure right there, those little needle bearings actually kind of roll out of the way. Mm-hmm. They can flow easier. Whereas a blend or a mineral-based oil, because they're not all uniform, they actually can kind of cluster together, and they'll actually act thicker. So they actually have a little bit more cushion to them that makes them run hotter.
Right.
They won't run as well at high temperature. That's what we were going to go back to earlier, is the 5 different groups. That's not, okay, 1's good, 2's better, 3's even better, 4's, and that 5's best. No,
it's what it
they're
was built
just
for.
different.
Yeah.
Well, they're just different. And that's the thing about chemistry and about oil, is that there's no best oil. They're all different chemistries. What we need to define the application. And even back to the first question about, you know, adding zinc or whatever for his 968, really it's not, what I should have asked him is, what's your application? Or is this just a restoration car that you drive to some Treffens and things like that, or to some just events, or do you track the car? Is it track car only? That's actually the more appropriate question that I should have asked. I kind of assumed that must have probably a street car. It's not a race guy. But, you know, that I shouldn't be presumptuous that way. Right. Application dictates the necessary chemistry. And then there are lots of different chemistries that all have their own pros and cons. There isn't one size fits all best oil. Doesn't exist.
Getting the right, it's like getting the right tool for the job. This next true-false question. This next true-false question is one that I hear a lot, and it was a question that I was asking when I was, you know, I have a '87 G50 car, and as synthetic oil became more prevalent, the question is, true or false? Synthetic oil causes leaks in older engines. True or false? True or false? True.
True.
What? I thought
it can.
I thought that's only because it's. I thought if you get the viscosity correct and it's you know, apples to apples there, if your engine is tight and whatever, that it shouldn't leak. But you're saying that this sounds like a trick question.
No, well, it kind of is. It can happen. I'm not saying that you take any older engine and you just pour synthetic in it, that it's 100% just going to leak straight out. No, I'm not saying that.
Okay.
But go back to, we talked about the base oil types. Remember that group 1 was solvent refined. And up until early 90s, that's the base oil that pretty much everyone used the world over, which means all the seal manufacturers, the guys who made the gaskets, they knew that. They knew that that was solvent refined oil that had traces of solvent left over in it that would cause the seals to swell. So they actually, it was engineered into how you make the gasket seal and keep them sealed up. So if you have this gasket that was that material designed for mineral-based oil, solvent refined, it's been running on that for years, it's swollen because of that. Now you go put in a synthetic oil that isn't solvent refined, and if it doesn't have a seal swell additive, it will cause them to shrink, and then it will leak. I have seen it happen.
If you do find a synthetic oil that has that seal swelling additive, then you should be good.
Should be fine. And actually today, of course, the materials today are a bit different. A lot of the, and this is where being in the Porsche community, we're actually in a good place, because the European version of API, which if you don't know, API is the American Petroleum Institute. They're the guys that, you know, set a lot of the standards. The little donut on the back of the motor oil bottle, that's who comes up with that. The European version of that is called ACEA, and it's made up of a very similar group between the car manufacturers and oil manufacturers. They actually have, in several of the sequence tests there, a seal compatibility test. So, yeah, so a lot of those oils modern synthetic oils today still has to pass those seal swell tests. So the reality, how often is it going to happen? Probably not very often, but it does happen. I've seen it happen. And oh, here, get that synthetic oil out, put this conventional oil back in, and the leaks go away. So it's true.
Oh, okay, okay. But that was a bit of a trick question.
Yeah,
speaking of a question,
they couldn't all be false. If they're all false, it wouldn't be any fun.
All right, so E30 hot shoe. This is a BMW fan, and you know we love all car enthusiasts. So welcome E30 hot shoe. For a DFI motor, what's the most important additive within a manufacturer's oil? Not an aftermarket additive, but an additive that you're looking for in an oil that you're choosing, a DFI motor.
The type and amount of detergent is the most important thing from an additive perspective for a DFI engine. For somebody that doesn't know, DFI means direct fuel injection, so that the fuel is being injected directly into the cylinder, not upstream through the manifold or from a carburetor or something like that. When you do that, those engines have a tendency to what's called have low speed pre-ignition. Essentially, because you're spraying fuel directly into the combustion chamber, it has a higher tendency to mix with the oil. So the detergent additive in the motor oil can actually change how much fuel will emulsify in the oil. And because oil has a lower octane value than fuel, see where I'm going with this, folks?
Yep.
A high mixture of oil and fuel together can lower the octane of the mixture in the combustion chamber and lead to detonation. And that's what low speed pre-ignition is, a fancy term for detonation that's caused by a mixing of oil and fuel. So it's very widely researched. There's lots of papers on it. Myself and some other guys, Derek Splitter and folks at Oak Ridge National Lab published a paper about this very topic. So that's why there's a new API spec that just came out back in May called API SP. So the old spec was API SN. We're now at API SP. And the reason for that is they've changed the detergent level, the detergent type, in order to make off-the-shelf motor oil safer for direct fuel injection engines.
Gotcha. Thanks. So we've got about 10 minutes.
I could speak for 2 hours alone just on that topic.
I know, and I hope you all are enjoying this, because this is how Lake talks all the time. I mean, this show literally could be 2 hours long and still wouldn't be enough for me to extract all of his knowledge on oil. So we've got about 10 minutes. I want to do a little show and tell here, and then we've got some quick run through of useful tools and common mistakes. So maybe we can get this camera over here and talk about the stuff that I have. Obviously, this is just a standard oil pan. That's not going to be enough if you have 9 quarts. But oils we talked about earlier, different kinds. If you have 996 Cayenne, you're probably used to seeing this kind of canister. If you have a G-body car, you're probably used to seeing something like that as an oil filter. And so the modern day cars that have this type with a cartridge, and if you guys are looking closely, you'll notice this cartridge does not go in this one. It's just one that I had open. What you'll want to do is always make sure when you're changing your oil is to look through the pleats for anything that might not look like it should be there. Something that is either, you might run a magnet, look at for silvery stuff. But sometimes I remember a friend of mine, Gregory, he had like plastic or rubbery chunks, and it turned out to be his chain ramps pieces break down into the. So the oil filter will tell you a lot, and some people even take a razor blade and cut it and pull open the pleats and really inspect it, because it can tell you a whole heck of a lot. Now, if you have a can type of oil filter, this is a really cool tool. made by, I guess, Filter Mag here. I don't know if you can see it. I think we have a quick video of me opening this filter. So what I did was I just popped off the ring. And if you've ever worked on plumbing and copper pipes and you have one of those little tube cutters, maybe they can show you the video where I attached it to this and you just spin it around. There's the video there. And then once you cut it open, there we go, spinning it around. I think it's best to be done on a vise, but I don't have a vise here at the office, so I just did it by hand. And it's just like cutting, copper tubing, like plumbing. Turn it a little bit more pressure, turn it, a little bit more pressure. And then it pops open, just like that. And then we can go back to, there you go. Now you have the inside, the cartridge, very similar to what you had with the other one. And again, you can take a closer look and it'll tell you what's going on with your engine. This little piece over here, as part of the bundle that the one winner got, this is a magnetic drain plug. Different brands have, make them. This one happens to be aluminum, and it has a magnet right there. The key thing is, it's very important. I've seen people install these and they over tighten them. And it's an aluminum piece. It doesn't need to be that tight. And sometimes if you over tighten them, they'll actually leak. So make sure your torque spec is on point when you're using something like that. Let's go to common mistakes. Common mistakes. We've got about 7 minutes, so Lake, we're going to have to go through these pretty quickly. I think common mistakes. Go ahead.
Well, I would say the one great thing is what you're showing with the filter inspection. That's really key. Is looking at that magnetic drain plug, seeing what's in the filter, because your eye can see down to about 30 microns ish. I mean, some people say it's as little as 20, 40. I got glasses, so who knows where I can really see anymore. So your eye can only see so far. So that visual inspection is really good for catching the big stuff. And then that next level we're going to talk about in a little while is the used oil analysis that can see those particles from 0 up to 10 micron. And that's why it is important to be doing that visual inspection, because oil analysis is awesome, but it still has its own limits where it can't see the particles bigger than 10 microns. So there's a little bit of a gap between, say, 10 and 20 that no one's going to see. But typically, if it's producing something around 15 to 17 microns in size, it's probably producing stuff that's probably 22, 25 microns in size as well, and you're going to be able to see that. So that's a great, great thing in terms of, common mistakes, things, is that not looking at that. I mean, every time you change the oil, you can look at your filter. So that would be a huge thing to not just throw away and not even look at. That's great data that's easily accessible.
And even for people that don't do their own oil changes, wherever you take your car to, you should ask them to show you the filter. Because if they don't bother looking at it and you don't see it, then that's a missed opportunity. And honestly, if I took my car to a shop and they weren't willing to show me the oil filter that they took out of my car, I might be looking for a different service shop. But let's run through real quickly the 5 top common oil mistakes. And a few of them we've already talked about. Choosing based on brand, which you shouldn't do. As Lake said, you should always choose based on the purpose or the original recipe, the reason why you need that oil, and then go to the brand that is reputable. Number 2, choosing a racing oil because it sounds better. Let's get back to that one. Let's go to the next one.
Okay.
Playing chemists with oil additives. You talked about that one earlier. It's not a good idea to mix your own, mixture in your oil reservoir there. Let the pros do it. Listening to advice from Bob, the oil guy. There's lots of forums out there that people profess, and I would challenge them and ask them if they are truly tribologist. If they're not a tribologist, then I might not listen to Bob, the oil guy. And of course, we talked earlier about improper oil change intervals, timing, introducing after, if you don't follow it, introducing sludge. So those are the 5 top common oil mistakes. But let's go back to number 2 about choosing racing oil just because it sounds better. Real quickly.
Well, a lot of times people think, okay, racing oil, that's made for this heavy duty, harsh environment. It's got to be a better oil. Well, that's kind of like saying taking Usain Bolt's shoes are the best ones for running a marathon. No, they're not. They're designed for sprint. I mean, think about it. The very best tires for a dry track day are the absolute worst tires for driving in the snow in the winter.
Right.
The design, the chemistry of the rubber compound is designed for that application. So racing oils are chemically refined and designed for that environment, which makes them not ideal for that low temperature daily driving type environment, not designed for long oil change intervals. So it's all about really that first thing.
Right.
Let the application dictate the chemistry. Everything else will flow from there. And that's where a lot of other things really kind of point always back to that. That's where you begin. Application dictates chemistry.
Yep. So we have a few minutes left, and I really want to take the end of the show to talk about oil analysis. We talked about how oil is the lifeblood of your car, much like when you go to the doctors once a year, hopefully you are, and you go to the blood bank or whatever, and you get your blood drawn, and they do an analysis on your blood to understand what's going on. So the SPEEDiagnostix kit that Lake here, we've talked about it in a video before. Walk me through, again, we only have a few minutes, of what one can expect when they submit their oil sample to a diagnostics company such as this.
Okay, so the real goal of used oil analysis is knowing the health of not only the oil, but also the equipment being sampled. It's a predictive maintenance tool. Yes, if you have had, you hear a knock or you see something in the filter, you can then send a sample off to try to get more information about the situation that's already occurred. But the real benefit, and that's not saying that's not a bad thing, because if you catch it early enough, then you can prevent that big spend. Engines are way easier to rebuild and way cheaper to rebuild when the crankcase halves don't have holes in them. Right, but once the rod goes to the side of the block, things are really expensive. So the real goal is to establish that baseline.
Right. Establish the baseline and have early detection of something that might be going wrong.
Exactly. Yeah. And it's that annual health checkup. I know we mentioned about the oil change and having even if you don't change your oil yourself, having the shop look at the filter or show you the filter. There are lots of shops that are using the SPEEDiagostix kits already as part of their service program for their customers. That, hey, when you get in, we're going to do this at least once a year. We're going to check it. If you're tracking your car, you need to do it more often. That way you can know the health and be ahead of it. And then if you see something come up, well, we know to hit the brakes, check on it, and then take corrective actions before it becomes a big problem that's really expensive. And the cool thing is, I know from SPEEDiagostix, my daughter Caroline is the one that runs that on a day-to-day basis, and I'm in the background helping make sure things are being done right. It's pretty cool to see how many engines have been saved. And the other thing that's interesting too is that the number one warning sign of a problem is fuel dilution. You wouldn't think it, but fuel dilution is common in 90% of the situations where there is a problem in the engine.
Huh. Well, folks, we are at the top of the hour, and as I said, I could talk to Lake for another 2 hours, and I still wouldn't extract all of his knowledge. I hope you enjoyed this episode, Motor Oil 101. Lake comes to PCA events all the time. If you have a chance to come to Tactics, if you have a chance to come to Porsche Parade, get to see him, or if wherever you might find him, if he's representing Total Seal and you bounce into him at a show. You know, Lake, thank you so much for spending the time. Everyone, I hope you enjoyed the episode. We'll be back 2 weeks from now, and I hope you liked the technical level that we had tonight. Please comment, please like, please subscribe. Stay safe, stay healthy, and we'll see you next time. Bye.